let's provide a map. Let's provide a mental framework for people to understand the parts of a given case. So there are three main parts. One is the intro, two is data gathering and analysis, and three is your conclusion. So your case starts off with a case prompt. Most of you are going to already be familiar with this. The interviewer is going to provide you with a business scenario and ask what you think about that and what you might do to figure it out. For example, your client manufactures and markets guitar amplifiers, and their profits have been going down in recent years. They want to know what they should do to improve their profits. So you get your case prompt. Next thing you should do is ask some clarifying questions. Some good things to ask about are, one, if there are any specific targets embedded in the case. A lot of times this will kind of tip you off to let you know that it's going to be more of a quantitative case, less of a qualitative case. And also sometimes if there is some type of target, you don't want to find that out a little bit later. It's better to know that up front. That being said, not every case is going to have a specific quantitative target. Other things you might want to ask in your clarifying questions are, one, to better understand how that business actually works. Some industries are very complicated. I'm looking at you, healthcare, where the entity that pays for it is different from the entity that might make the recommendation on what to purchase, which is different from the actual consumer of the product. So if it's unclear on how that business actually works and who the entities are that are participating in that transaction, you might want to confirm that. And one way to do that, and I think a great way to do that, is not to just ask. You want to hypothesize what you think it is. So instead of saying, how does this business work, or who are the exact customers, you might want to say, okay, this is a healthcare industry. I know this can be quite complex. I imagine that our patients are recommended to our client service by their doctors. And then when they actually pay for it, it's probably some combination of their insurance and some type of copayment. Is that right? And you might be wrong, you might be right. And as long as it makes sense, it's logical and is a plausible scenario, it's better to be hypothesis driven than to just ask an open-ended question. So once you've asked some clarifying questions and you have a good sense of what the problem is, who the company is, then you can start with your framework. Now, your framework is, people tend to overthink the framework. And what you want to do is you want to provide a very structured map of things you want to look at that are going to get you the answer. There are thousands of directions that a case can actually go. And many of these, there are multiple paths that are very highly likely. And there's no way you're going to know this up front. You might have an inkling of where it can go, but you can by no means be sure. But what you can do is think about some of the main issues that are going to help you determine which path this case is actually going down. For example, if it's a profitability issue, maybe this is driven by a cost side problem, it's a revenue side problem, and then qualitatively, maybe you're facing pricing pressure from competitors, maybe it's a regulatory issue, but take some time to think about what are the big issues in a lot of different business problems. I mean, do this before you actually are in your case, and think about how you might structure it in a way that makes sense to you and is also an effective way to get to the answer. And this will make more sense as you see more frameworks and do more cases. Next, you're going to make a hypothesis from your framework. You're going to take something and think about how it can get you closer to answering the original question. So you're really going to ask for data that's going to confirm or dispute your hypothesis. And when I say data, I mainly mean data in either qualitative form or quantitative form. At this point, you're deep in the midst of the data gathering and analysis loop. So you're going to ask for data. You'll receive some data either as answers or exhibits. You're going to analyze that data. You synthesize your data. You think about what's the implications of it. And then you think to yourself if you can make a conclusion about the original question. The first time you go through this loop, it's highly unlikely you're going to answer it right off the bat. So you're probably going to want to go through this loop a number of times. It's pretty common for the first couple times around the loop to be pretty qualitative things to get some context, to understand what is the industry situation, what is the competitive situation. I mean, this really varies by the case, but you'll get some qualitative information to understand the overall context. And then there's almost always some type of math exercise. So that analyzing the data can take the form of thinking about things qualitatively or doing actual calculations to get a data-driven answer. And that will happen in the vast majority of cases. So after going through this a few times, you'll be able to know if you can make a conclusion about the original question. And usually when this happens, you can synthesize what you're thinking, provide your thought process, and often the interviewer might ask you to brainstorm ideas or add a new twist. We're going to go into that in a little bit, but let's assume they did not. And if you've gotten close to the answer, you've done all the math exercises, you have most of the information, often the interviewer will ask you to summarize your answer. If they were to do that, what you want to do is provide an answer first conclusion. It is very tempting to talk about all of the things you did, all of the analyses you did, what you learned, what you thought about, and then end with the answer, almost like a mystery novel. That is the opposite of what you want to do. You want to start with your conclusions, and then you want to provide the analysis that supports your conclusions, and then talk about some of the more interesting second-order implications and insights. A common way to do that is to talk about risks and next steps, but the important thing is that you're thinking about some of the important second-order implications, and you're not just saying, okay, great, we should do this, the profits, it's going to give us a 20% return on investment, let's go ahead and do it. While that's great and that's important to do, especially if your answer first, you still want to have some second order implications and things to show that you're thinking a little bit more deeply about this issue. And once again, that's something you'll see within the live case course content that we have. Now, it's also possible that the interviewer does not ask you to summarize the answer, is kind of looking at you like you probably should be asking more questions, or they might say, well, what about this? So it's very possible that you did not get enough information to reasonably make a conclusion. So if that's the case, you definitely need to read your interviewer, and you might have to go back into the loop. Now, it's also possible that your interviewer is just having an interesting conversation with you, and they're adding a new twist to see how you think. Maybe you were a total rock star and got through this data gathering and analysis piece very, very quickly and very efficiently, and you were able to do that in a way that provided a lot of your insights. And now you're having an interesting conversation about other implications of the case. And this can also manifest itself where the interviewer will ask you to brainstorm ideas or add some new twist. In that case, what you want to do is create a mini framework. And you want to be very structured whenever you're in kind of a creative brainstorming exercise. One thing to keep in mind is that being structured doesn't end when your framework ends. You want to be structured throughout your entire case. And one great place for this is when you get that creative brainstorming exercise. So you have two options for this. One, you can kind of put together a structure on the fly, or you can take about 15 seconds or so to create a little mini structure. And that's a real personal preference thing. You might find that you are able to think about it very, very briefly and then just put together that framework and talk about it on the fly. Or you might be someone who needs 20 seconds or so to put together that framework. If you do fall in the latter camp, two things to keep in mind. One, you want to ask if that's okay. The interviewer might say, no, let's hear what you have to say. That's less likely, but you definitely want to be polite and ask if it's okay. The second thing to keep in mind is whenever you take time in a case, the bar goes up. So if you say, sure, can I take a few moments to think about how I might brainstorm some ideas for this, the more time you take, the higher the bar goes up. So if those 20 seconds are not really going to do much for you, I would just go ahead and create your structure as you're going along. So that is one thing you're going to have to practice, see what fits you best, and then that's basically what you're going to need to do during the actual case. So you brainstorm your ideas, and most likely they'll ask you to summarize the answer, and you'll provide an answer first conclusion. Once you do that, you can celebrate because you've made it. Congratulations. So hopefully this is helpful to give you a sense of how to go from the beginning of the case to the end of the case, so that In the middle of the case, you might realize that you're somewhere in the third iteration of the data gathering and analysis loop. And to keep in mind that your job is to synthesize the data and come up with a good recommendation. And that if they do ask you to brainstorm ideas, you don't necessarily freak out, because that might actually just be the creative brainstorming section of the case. You do have to read your interviewer. That's a critical skill to success in this. But this map can be helpful to keep in the back of your mind so you know what you need to do and where you need to go. So now I think we can jump into some live cases.